Well, ladies and gentlemen, many of you have been here for the whole day now, and we're going to start in this fourth session. As you know, and as you might heard up to now, globalization is at stake. While economy and business are seizing the opportunities of globalization, more and more people in different countries oppose it. US President Trump 1 year ago was, at least partly, elected by the so-called globalization losers. We talked about them for many times up to now. The British Brexit vote in June 2016 was a vote not only against the European Union, but also against globalization, which has brought immigrants and various forms of competition to the British country and the British people. Switzerland itself is one of the most globalized countries in the world. According to the COF Globalization Index, Switzerland is in the 5th place. It has the highest rate of multinational companies per capita. Cross-border trade and investments, as well as revenues, are significantly high. Personal contacts on the international level and cross-border information flow are part of our daily life. And many international organizations are based in Switzerland. Since the early days of industrialization, the success of the Swiss economy has been founded on the complementary relationship between domestic production and demand on the one hand, and participation in global trade on the other. By this, Switzerland is a winner of globalization. For several years, it has held first place not only in the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, but also in the Global Innovation Index, and it is one of the most wealthiest countries in the world. These excellent positions in international rankings should give little room for doubt about globalization. And yet, in February 2014, Swiss people voted against mass immigration as a reaction to the European rule of free movement of persons. This was a vote not only against the bilateral agreements with the European Union, but also against some effects of globalization. Data alone no longer seem to be compelling enough that positive effects of globalization outweigh the negative ones. Looking at political decisions in the last years, we live a clear shift. Years ago, globalization critics, or rather enemies, protested on the streets, in front of G20 or Davos meetings. Today, more ordinary people fight against globalization in a much more discreet way, namely by voting for conservatives, nationalists, and populists, all those who oppose globalization, open borders, and international agreements of almost any kind. Are people right in doing so? Do they stop globalization by voting for anti-globalists? What would or should people's world look like without globalization? What arguments could convince them for the opposite? So far, today's sessions had a nearly exclusive focus on economic and business topics, although many of the panels before talked about globalization losers and welfare state and all these questions. Nevertheless, we will take into account on this panel, especially political, social, and cultural perspectives. What are the pros and cons of globalization for the people, the societies, the nation states? What effect does globalization have on our identities, culture, and politics? How important is culture for the success of a political system? And to what extent can globalization disturb it? Regarding the values we hold high, which of the arguments for or against globalization do we find acceptable? Which ones not? And why? And does economic liberalism, which is strong for favor of globalization, really need political and social liberalism as well? For this discussion, we have with us two highly respected personalities and globalization experts, very well known in international politics. Carl Bildt was Sweden's foreign minister from 2006 to 2014. Before that, he was prime minister from 1991 to 1994, when he negotiated Sweden's EU accession. He was a member of parliament for over 20 years and the leader of the center-right moderate party, almost 15 years. As a renowned international diplomat, he served as special envoy from the EU as well as from the UN to the former Yugoslavia, a mission that he concluded as a co-chairman of the Dayton Peace Conference. Today, Carl Bildt is chair of the Global Commission on Internet Governance and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Europe. Grover Norquist is president of Americans for Tax Reform, a taxpayer advocacy group founded by himself in 1985 at President Reagan's request. Norquist also chairs the Washington, D.C.-based Wednesday meeting, a weekly gathering of more than 150 elected officials, political activists, and movement leaders. Ms. Norquist also serves on the board of directors of the National Rifle Association of America, the American Conservative Union, the Parental Rights Organization, and the Center for the National Interest, formerly the Nixon Center. He serves as contributing editor to the American Spectator magazine, and he serves as president of the American Society of Competitiveness. These are the panelists we have, and we are going to talk about how much globalization do we want? Mr. Bildt.
That's me.
Yes. You call yourself a firm believer in the benefits of globalization.
I do.
And you still defend everything. And what are your benefits? Well, what are the benefits that you put
down? I have one picture, if I can show that. See if that materializes. Okay, I can take it verbally then. We won't. Here it is. I think this sums it up to a very large extent. I've been around for some time. I was born in a world where there was roughly 2.5 billion people. And we now live in a world where there are 7.5 billion people. And I remember when I was at university and student politics and whatever it was, the prevailing view in the global debate was that this was not going to work. The world was going to, population boom, everyone was going to, in poverty, the third world was going to rise up, all of that. What has happened? What we've seen here, you see the population increasing, and the red is the number of people living in poverty in the world. Instead of that going up, particularly during the last quarter of a century, we've had a dramatic decrease in that. As a matter of fact, I mean, the number of people living in poverty in the third world has gone from roughly 50% to less than 10%. And if you add other indicators, I mean, child mortality has been cut by roughly half and people live longer, I would argue that this era, the last quarter of a century, which has really been globalization coming back with force, has probably been the best quarter of a century for mankind, probably ever. Absence of major wars, a new global middle class from Shanghai to Sao Paulo, enormous increases in social indicators, and people overall in the world being happier. You can say that people are dissatisfied with globalization, be that in Zurich or in Stockholm. But go to Sao Paulo, go to Shanghai, go to even Africa where things are starting to move, go to New Delhi, and the view is a different one. They see this as the opportunity to better world, and the record speaks in their favor.
Mm-hmm. So you have clear evidence that globalization is good for the global world. Mm-hmm. But if you have enemies or if you have critics of globalization, we find them within the countries. And you, Mr. Norquist, you're also known not only as a fighter against taxes or high taxes or wherever you say they're high or low, but also...
They're always too high.
I know. That's a clear statement. Yes, but you're also known as a supporter of President Trump. And he doesn't really like globalization, at least not for his country. I'm not talking about his business, but for his country. What Mr. Bildt said, that globalization is good for the global world, is not good for one country. How do you see it?
Well, I think if you look at that chart, a lot of that progress is China moving towards property rights for farmers and taking what was the 100% tax on everything you made up to your quota down to a 25% tax. So for a good chunk of the world, 1 billion people, 90% of them have come out of poverty, property rights, low taxes. And free markets are a good idea. The advantage of free trade, and we're going to have a discussion about, does globalization mean managed trade, where other people tell you what you can do and can't do, or does it mean really free and open trade? Where you have free and open trade, whether it's Hong Kong doing it unilaterally, you don't have to negotiate with Hong Kong to have free trade. They say, we're here. And they became rich with that policy, not waiting to negotiate trade agreements. So how much of it is, when you take free trade, better with property rights and low taxes, and you expand that, reducing tariffs is reducing taxes. The United States is a country that was paying between 1% and 2% of its GDP in taxes when we were a colony of Britain. They were paying 20% in London. We were paying 1% to 2%. They wanted to go to 3%, and we started shooting at them. But a lot of that was tariffs too. So for a lot of world history, taxes were tariffs. And so taking tariffs down, moving to more free and open trade, is a question of reducing the tax drag. The United States, 50 states, it's an open market inside the 50 states. Whatever silliness we do from time to time in 1832 or 1920 and 28, we do have an open capital moves, people move, goods move, tax-free within one of the larger economic zones in the world.
You know, both stress now really the economic globalization. And in the other panels, many people talked about the globalization losers and side effects. If we now take the economic theory that says, and you mentioned it, the 4 liberties, goods, services, capital, and labor. These 4 have to be free, and then we have these growing benefits in the world. But don't you think that people in the countries, they might like or they prefer the liberties of goods? Services are already difficult. Capital can harm, is not just good, at least we see it now, and labor is very criticized. From the people's perspective, shouldn't we more separate between those 4 liberties, or just say all of them or none?
The European Union is built on the 4 freedoms, as you know. And
that's why it is criticized a lot.
Well, yeah, but there is also a philosophical foundation to it. I mean, the United States is built on the 4 freedoms, as a matter of fact. Sweden is built on the 4 freedoms, but go back 200 years in time, we didn't have it. We had tariffs between the different cities. We have all sorts of restrictions inside the country. And then we built a better country by liberalizing it internally, and we are now liberalizing inside Europe. And overall, I think the advantages are substantial. If you look at what's happening in sort of the 100 million people that were taken into the European Union from Central Europe, there's no question that they have benefited substantially from these 4 freedoms. Element of mobility, absolutely. Is that a good or bad thing? Well, there were some ancestors that went to... The name Norquist, as you might know, is a Swedish name. So it's, migration has happened.
And your mother comes from Switzerland, isn't it?
Stein on Rhine.
Yes, so...
Yeah, but there was also a Swedish component.
Migration background, as we call it.
But going back to the question, I do think that when we talk now about sort of backlash against globalization, I think first it's overblown in the debate, which might not be necessarily wrong, because then we can focus on the issue slightly. But I would say it is not a question of trade being the problem. It's not a question of economic globalization being the problem. If there is insecurity, it is a cultural one. And that we've seen driving, I think, to a certain extent, Trump, certainly Brexit. And if there's economic insecurity, it has less to do with trade than with technology. We are living in a period of a tsunami of technological changes that puts all of our economies under stress, but I would say with you mentioned the Swiss economy and what that is. I could talk about the Swedish economy, the US economy, among the most competitive economies of the world. Also huge opportunities to use it. But change is to a certain extent always stressful, and cultural factors are more significant in the debate that we're having now than I think economic factors are.
So you would say people should not blame globalization, but they should blame technology?
They shouldn't blame technology. They shouldn't blame technology, but seeing that technology does mean that we'll have to change. I mean, the single biggest change in my, well, slightly before my lifetime, but anyhow, that we've had in the Swedish economy was that, go back, our country is a big one, big country, forests all over the place, which means that forestry was enormously big. Well, forestry was done with axe and horse, and was immensely manpower intensive. And the mechanization of forestry, I mean, the number of people who lost jobs, generations, was immense. Did that make Sweden a worse place? No. Of course, they live much better in those areas than they did before. But it was a tremendous, I mean, there's virtually no one working in forestry any longer, in spite of the fact that wood products is still the biggest net exporter of Sweden. But it doesn't employ that very many. They are employed in other sectors of the economy. Change is happening all the time.
But if you look at exactly these changes in the US, it was those people who voted also for Trump and helped him to become president. Those who feared to lose their jobs, those who feared to lose their manufacturing jobs, we talked about them before. Isn't this an effect of globalization also?
Okay, back up on the Trump thing, because I'm not sure, I heard earlier people explaining who was voting for Trump, why, and what happened. In the United States, the modern Republican Party has been growing in the country for a couple of decades. Before Trump became president, we had the House, we had the Senate, we had 28 of the 50 states that have complete Republican control. They run the governorship in both houses. If the Republicans can all agree on what they want to do, they can turn themselves into Texas or Hong Kong as quickly as they want. Democrats run 8 states now, and where they have the governorship in both houses, and they can turn themselves into California or Greece as quickly as they wish to, and they're working on it. But when Trump was elected, we lost House seats, the Republican Party, and lost Senate seats. All the contested senators ran ahead of Trump. So I think it's very helpful that Trump won, because he signs bills that wouldn't have happened. And even on some of the issues we're going to talk about, I would argue he's better for a free market and open American economy than Obama was. But this idea that people who don't like Trump explain a lot of uneducated, Goombas are out voting for him in various districts. If you look at the states he carried, several things happened. In Wisconsin, state that was very Democrat, in the middle of the industrial heartland, they passed a law 4 years ago that said you can't be forced to join a union to work in the public sector. 137 million people quit paying dues to the union, said I don't want to be part of the public sector unions that you said I had, to a teacher or anybody else. And that cost the left $137 million. The teacher making $50,000 had $1,000 taken in dues. So the labor union structure, which is the backbone of the modern Democratic Party, was tremendously weakened in the state, meaning it was made voluntary. You weren't allowed to steal money anymore. That's the dirty trick we played on them. And if you couldn't play with stolen money, you didn't have as much, and you couldn't win the Senate race or the presidential race. A version of that also in Michigan, another key industrial state as well. So the structures of the Democratic Party were collapsing. Were they hollowed out because organized labor had raised wages and work rules and the environmentalists had made various things difficult? Yeah, that was hollowed out by federal policy and organized labor. But the collapse of the Democrats in those states was a function of not being able to deal with money taken by force from union members. Not some sort of, let's vote on trade today.
So if I listen to you both, there are no really globalization losers. There are technology losers and a wrong democratic policy.
Well,
So, but if you look what happens in the world, that people elect populists, they elect conservative people, They elect movements that want to shut down the borders. This has nothing to do with globalization?
Well, it depends on how you define
Or what
it.
would you explain then?
No, I would say that what we have, I mean, first we've had a fracturing of the European political landscape. US is different, but there's been a fracturing, which has to do also with the decline of the big parties. I mean, if you go back in the history of Western Europe, particularly after the war, it was dominated really by the big social democratic chunk and the big Christian democratic chunk. Those are, particularly the social democratic, all over the place, have been declining, partly for the same reasons, by the way, partly for those reasons, and also the Christian democratic conservative fracturing. And we have greens and browns and blacks and God knows yellows all over the place in a way that we haven't had. That's part of what has been happening. Then you have the economic and technological change that has come. But I don't think that has led to any major, that is one of the major reasons for this.
So what is it then?
Well, you might say that the fracturing of the political landscape, take the left of the politics of Europe. There used to be something, it's 100 years since the Russian Revolution. You remember there was something called the proletariat. There was an industrial working class. There was a big chunk of, a big collective that could vote in a certain way. That has disappeared. We are middle-class societies that are far more multifaceted, far more diverse than we used to be. You see that reflected in the politics. Then you have, as part of that, you have those that are afraid, culturally or economically. They've always been there, but they were integrated better in the political systems in the past. And you see a significant chunk of them have come from what used to be the center-left, as a matter of fact. Look at voting patterns in Germany, look at voting patterns in Austria lately, for example. But we have that. We have, say that we have sort of 20% of the electorate in Europe that is angry and dissatisfied. But that is not news. But the fact that the parties have been less able to handle that, that's news.
Can I square the circle for you on this? In the United States, there was a great deal of grumpiness going into the last election. People were unhappy. When we had 2% growth for 8 years of the Obama recovery, which started July of 2009, the economy was in recovery, meaning it was positive growth. It was 2%. The average since World War II is about 3.5%, including recessions, okay? So 2% growth is very bad, makes people very grumpy. Real unemployment's 8% if you count people who quit looking but are still of an age to work and would work if there were jobs, but they don't think there are any. It's not 4% today, it's still 8%, and it was worse than 8% a few years ago. So the economy sucks, it's very bad, and people are very grumpy. And some brother doesn't have a job, or dad doesn't have a job, or mom doesn't have a job, or somebody has a job or 2 jobs but doesn't pay very well. They're very grumpy. What do they say? Was it caused by globalization? No. But people say, oh, I don't have a job because an immigrant took my job. I don't have it, nobody's moving into West Virginia. I don't have a job because those Chinese people are selling us stuff inexpensively, which is very irritating. I wish they'd stop. And I like Walmart selling me stuff inexpensively, but not the Chinese people. But you have this throughout American history. When the economy gets bad, people look around and they don't like immigrants and they want to restrict immigrants and they don't like trade because they think that's the reason. Now, I think you look at it and say, well, let's see, taxes have been raised, regulations have been raised, all sorts of assaults on the economy over the last 20 years, including Bush, the expenses of wars and occupying other people's countries that we can't pronounce. All of these things are problematic, hurt the economy, make people grumpy, but it's a little easier to articulate for immigrants, foreigners, it's easy to blame them because they're usually not here, but immigrants somewhere and trade competition get people mad. The good news is if you generally think a more open society is good for the world and people and life and all sorts of stuff, and the economy, is that with growth reduces grumpiness. Reagan inherited something like what we've got in the United States over the last year. We had an economy under Carter that was actually declining, not just on a per capita GDP, it was declining. We had 10% unemployment several years in a row, 20% interest rates, and people were very, very grumpy. And when Reagan came in, they demanded all sorts of protectionism, and he cut taxes, and the day that the tax cuts became effective January 1st, 1983. We saw in the next 18 months 12% growth in the economy, 12% growth. 1 million people got jobs in October of that year. 1 million Americans got jobs in 1 month, 4 million in the first year. Strong economic growth. A few years later, 1986, he amnestied millions of mostly Mexican Americans who'd been in the country for some time. I mean, people from all over, but more heavily Mexican Americans, or Mexicans, who then became Mexican Americans. No grumpiness on that. And he started NAFTA moving. No grumpiness there. Why? Because things were going well, and we had economic growth, and we weren't blaming the other for the problems because we weren't having the problems. So deregulation, which is half of what Reagan did, and tax cuts, which is the other half in terms of economic growth, allow for less grumpy electorate, and people don't go around trying to blame people during growth. But there was massive technological change at that point, too. We had 800 major changes in the Fortune 500 companies, complete restructures in an 8-year period. 800, meaning bunches of them did it more than once. Federal government had no major restructuring during that period. But that level of change, a lot of people got laid off, but because the economy was growing, they found other jobs.
So a growing economy is key.
Yes,
that's what we
yes.
know. And
Makes
the question
people grumpy
is,
if you don't
yes,
have
and when we look at the data, we heard this day that trade, international trade, is fostering economic growth. But not for everybody. This was a clear statement this morning on one of the panels that you can see that there are also losers. And the question is, if you say, okay, economic growth is the one thing we need to have, how do you explain to people who really lose within this economic growth? How do you explain them to go further the way that we went for the last
I think we need
decades?
to sort of explain, for example, Sweden or Switzerland, the United States, that sort of structural change is necessary. Otherwise, you lose. If we are not competitive in the future, we lose, and all jobs will be gone. But we have to take away that is what is uncompetitive in our economies, and by technological change, that's going to be quite a lot, and invest those resources, be that capital, be that intellectual resources, or be that manpower, in the sectors where we believe that we can be competitive on the world markets tomorrow. To either stop that process, then you lose out very quickly, then you end up in Greece or something like that, sun, but nothing else, or you have to isolate your country totally and be in North Korea, to take the extreme examples.
You can do this by...
And I said, we are living in a period of very profound technological change, so structural change will be there, and it's the duty of political leaders to explain it.
Yes, and you can do this now, you can explain it, you can do it by economic policy, passive or active, whatever, but you can also do it by the welfare state. For example, you can help people, those people who suffer within a certain time, you can help them.
Yep.
And you as a social democrat in a Nordic country, you made much of it.
More or less. Yeah.
Is this an important solution?
I do think that one of the most important things that it's, if you look at historically, why did Sweden do well during industrialization? We were one of the poorest countries in Europe. A couple of factors. One of them was that we introduced a very universal system of education. So we got a people that was fairly well educated, and that was a key factor. Now, when we go into this next phase of the digital society, clearly we need to sort of increase education, change education, and be prepared to re-educate all of us, by the way, not only those that are the losers, but also the winners, because the winners today will be the losers tomorrow with the pace of change they're going to have. And there is no question that there is a significant role for public policy in both sort of taking care of the immediate problems and sort of the basics and research and development to make certain that we are at the very front of these developments, and particularly for smaller countries, of which Sweden is one, to do it together with others.
You might not be really in favor of a welfare state, I guess.
Well, the welfare state's one of the causes of the problem. When you're talking about, why don't some people want to get a new job? Well, in certain parts of Pennsylvania, you would have to get a $36,000 job in order to make more money than you could get off of the various welfare programs all added together that you would have access to. So when you pay people unemployment insurance not to work for as long as they want to not work. That doesn't keep everybody from working, but on the margin it does. I worked in a factory in Massachusetts, and everybody was expecting everybody to come back, and then the state extended the unemployment benefits, and everybody called in and said, well, we'll see you at the end of 3 months when the new unemployment benefits give up. So for quite some people, that was, in fact, part of the stickiness of not being willing to change. I was in Edinburgh years ago working for the Tories, trying to save the Tories in Scotland. Didn't work. But I'm watching TV, and they're interviewing this guy, and they say, well, a lot of jobs have been created. And this is in Wales. The guy says, not in this valley. You know, nobody was expected to go to the next valley or go down the street or move. And we actually have subsidies for various parts of the United States where if you don't move, they'll pay you if you want to stay. And they do. So the challenge is the welfare state can, with bad incentives and telling somebody as long as you're unemployed, we're going to send you a check, as opposed to something that was being argued before. Somebody goes unemployed, give them a certain amount of money and say, here's your check, you can go find a job tomorrow, or you can stay and live off that as long as you want to. But the marginal cost of getting a job is now zero, as opposed to that check is the cost of getting a job, is one of the costs. So that stickiness causes the damage. It doesn't fix the problem, it makes it worse.
So you want people to move? People move within globalization?
Mobility within, well,
yes.
The United States is big enough that we can talk about mobility within the country, and it's gotten worse, partially because of the welfare stickiness. Yeah.
But mobility within the country, this is one thing, but we have mobility over the country, internationally, globally. And if I come back to Europe, I would say that the migration movement of the last year is one of the most critics of the European Union, the free movement of people within the European Union, but also the migration from outside. Don't you think that this migration phenomenon is one of the causes of the criticism or the skepticism or the fears for globalization in the last years?
Well, there's no question that the experience, but particularly the autumn of 2015, was a traumatic one, particularly in Germany, Austria, to a certain extent Sweden, because there was a feeling among people that we were losing control of the situation. To a certain extent, that was correct, by the way, because we were not prepared for those sorts of waves that came. And now we are busy setting up the system so that we can cope with that, both in X numbers of different respects. So no question, that has to be dealt with. At the same time...
Is also a question of political globalization or international power? Or is it only a question of the nation state?
Well, in this particular case, it was a question of different things. I mean, we did have a war in Syria. Unfortunately, we still have a war in Syria. We have the largest numbers of refugees in the world, and at the moment, most of them are in the vicinity of Europe. Our systems, Dublin and whatever they are called, were not meant to deal with things of this order, at the same time as we want to preserve the freedom of movement inside the European Union. This didn't add up. And what is now underway inside the EU is to set up the systems that I think would be able to cope with the 2015. But so absolutely there was a problem. And absolutely, if we look at election result in a couple of countries, there's an effect of that. At the same time, we took, I think, sort of 1 million or 1.5 million in Europe. That is what the EU takes in annually anyhow, because we need it for demographic reasons. If I go around the startup scene in Stockholm, they are screaming for people, and they are importing them from all over the world, be they from Serbia, be they from Bangladesh, or be they from India. And the only problem is that we can't get them in fast enough, because we can't supply our economy any longer with the manpower that is needed to supply the fast-growing sectors of our economy. Does that mean that Swedes are losing their jobs? Well, we have the highest level of employment in the Swedish economy that we ever had, in spite of these particular factors. So, absolutely, there's a cultural factor. 2015 was a significant problem. We need to fix that. But we are dependent on migration as well. And but that's a foreign policy issue, we need to handle the mess of the Middle East, migration, refugees, Africa, but that's slightly bigger issues.
And do you prefer migration just to be open for everyone at any time?
Well, I'm in favor of more open immigration than we have now in the United States. I think we should take more immigrants than we do. I think certainly the H-1B visas for talented, highly talented people should be fairly open-ended. But we need low-end workers as well. 80% of the people who milk cows in the United States are not legally in the United States. 80%. That's, we need more Americans. And the United States grew from being 3 million people on the other side of the planet with open immigration up until the Anti-Chinese Act, which was organized by organized labor in the United States in the 1880s. That's a pretty long time. And very low taxes and back and forth on the free trade. This impulse towards protectionism has been around. The Federalists put in, protectionism, and South Carolina in 1832, called out the militia and said, "Okay, we've had it with you guys." That was, and the government backed down on the tariff of abominations, but there was a movement for tariffs and a free trade. All 13 colonies sent people to the free trade, open trade convention against the federal government and got tariffs down again. So that fight's been going on for quite some time in the United States, and we did it again with Herbert Hoover, who threw up massive Smoot-Hawley tariff acts and helped give us the Great Depression. It's not been a policy that's worked well on keeping trade out, and I would argue that our successful empires have people coming into them, whether it's Carthage or Rome or new people coming in, new life, new blood, youth. China's problem and Japan's problem. The Harvard Business School professor was talking. I went to Harvard Business School 79 to 81, and everyone was quite convinced that Japan was going to own the world. And I said, well, I don't think so. They're going to have a collapsing number. They're forgetting to have babies, for starters. And you can't import people to Japan because for cultural reasons they don't do immigration, even with the Koreans very well. China has the same challenges. China's labor force is beginning to contract, and that's going to continue to decline. I think this whole population control hysteria that got up in the 70s was a CIA plot to do in China, and they convinced the Chinese to go to one child, and now they're never going to be a major world power going out 100 years. It's quite successful.
So if I listen to both of you, before coming to you and giving you the possibility to ask some questions, when I'm listening to you, I just think that this is none of globalization. We have technology, we have
stupid government policy,
stupid government, too strong state. So globalization is not the problem. So we're just talking about, we just use globalization as
globalization has become
as a phenomenon to put everything in it that is not good in the world.
That has been the tenor of the debate now for some time, which I think is wrong. That doesn't mean that there aren't challenges. Mm-hmm. I mean, as said, structural change, are we ready for it? Can we adopt public policies, some of them stupid, some of them clever?
What should we do?
In terms of public policies?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I happen to believe, I'm a sort of free trade believer, but I do believe that requires also agreements of different sorts to set standards and take away the obstacles that are there. The thing that is happening now...
So more free trade?
Well,
or more managed free trade?
Well, what worries me at the moment is the entire digital side. We discussed in the previous very good panel, all of the focus was on trading goods, containers and ships and blah, blah, blah. But the big thing is data. And all of the goods are now associated with data. And there's a tendency in the world today for data localization and requirements and government control or whatever. We need standards. We need agreements on those sorts of things. Otherwise, we'll miss the entire digital revolution there. And all of the normal goods and services also associated with data. Mm-hmm. That's a big issue. You can't do that without governments behaving together in a good way. Governments can behave in bad ways and in good ways. I'm in favor of governments behaving in good ways.
No.
Then I said education, increasingly important, no question about that. Research and development, which is related to that. A lot of that is done by industry and business sector. But I mean, the basic university and things like that, there I think it's obvious that we need to do more in Europe, fostering a climate of innovation. All of this in order to make certain that when people are losing jobs as a product of structural change, which will happen, that there are the other jobs coming.
So
Which
assuring them for a change,
which has been
and helping them to...
has been the historical pattern so far, and if we are wise enough, I don't see any reason why that historical pattern should stop, although we should be aware of the fact that in all probability, in my opinion at least, change is accelerating.
So a certain role of the state, and for you, a little role of the state.
Well,
So globalization is not the problem, just
No,
cut down the
globalization-
government and then...
globalization is the scapegoat used by the people who caused the problem. Okay? Organized labor, which made whole industries sclerotic and made it difficult for American companies to compete, said, oh, you know what the problem is? It's foreign trade. It's not what we've done. They hollowed out a whole part of the country, which happens to be the part that was unionized, and happens to be the industries that were unionized. You know, oddly enough, didn't happen in Texas. And then they say, oh, it's foreigners did that. It's foreigners trading with us, and it's foreigners coming and working here. That's the problem. And they do this to say it couldn't possibly be over-regulation. Americans spend $2 trillion paying for the cost of regulations, not taxes. Regulations. Couldn't be that we have too many regulations. Couldn't be that the unions are too powerful. It must be all these foreign guys. It's a deliberate effort to misdirect. And to just remind people, and everybody goes Trump because he's so interesting to talk about, and he tweets, and it's kind of interesting. And he must have done it. But in the late 2000s, under Bush, he wanted to do a immigration reform, and we had support among Republicans and Democrats to get something there, and that bill was killed. It was killed when a senator walked in with a letter explaining that the AFL-CIO would not tolerate a guest worker program, and therefore this whole thing wasn't going anywhere. It was dropped on the table, and it died. The guy carrying that letter was named Barack Obama. Senator Barack Obama killed immigration reform in the 2006-2007 period when they were trying to get it done. So this is a challenge where organized labor, it was them telling him to tell that, and he was getting his chops with organized labor so he could run for president, which worked. This is a real challenge. There isn't a single anti-immigrant piece of legislation in American history going back to the anti-Chinese immigration, the anti-Japan. They didn't get the law in Japan. They just talked the Japanese guys into stop sending them because they had an emperor. China didn't, so they actually passed laws against Chinese people. Every single anti-immigrant bill was organized and pushed by the organized labor.
Except the very youngest one.
What?
Except the very youngest one.
Which one? Oh, the new one that Trump's, yeah, they don't even have that legislation from. Yes, until now, but watch for where labor is on this. Every time I would go and do press conferences with guys over the last 40 years, our opposition was always organized labor, including when we wanted to get Iraqis who'd been translators for the United States into the United States so nobody would kill them. They can't do that. So it's a major problem, and they keep going, don't look at us, them. Good news is that it's a declining part of the American economy, and there's a Supreme Court decision that will be decided in June called the Janus case, not the Roman god with two heads or two faces, but Janus. And that will say that public sector union members do not have to pay dues. Look for it. It was already going to be decided last year when Scalia was writing it, and he passed away, and then we didn't get a new guy until just now. But it's now a 5-4 majority to take away forced, coerced union dues as a condition of employment for the 7 million public sector workers who pay dues right now in the United States. That will change the debate on a whole series of issues and make trade easier and a rational immigration policy easier.
Okay. So, I wanted to have your question. There's one in the front there, and the next one just already over there. Yes.
So I have a question that relates to a graph or some data we saw this morning, and there seems to be one very robust fact that holds now for decades. That is, the more open an economy is, the higher developed is the welfare state. There's a clear relationship. Danny Roderick has written on it, Kevin O'Rourke showed it, and I think that tells us something. So because globalization goes together with increased risk, so it exposes, there's more volatility, there is more competition, there is increased risks, and economic theory tells us that some of these risks should be insured. And private insurance does not exist. There's almost nowhere on the globe is a private unemployment insurance, so you need to provide social insurance. And social insurance is a provision for the, basically to protect people for the increased social risks. Now, it's of course true that you can organize this insurance system in a stupid way or in a clever way. So you organize it in a stupid way, you pay it indefinitely, but if you organize it like it's done in Switzerland or in Germany or in Austria, where nobody gets unlimited unemployment insurance, so you are offered jobs, and if you don't take them, if you don't show an interest in finding a job, they cancel, they basically take away the insurance from you. So basically you can organize social insurance systems in an efficient way. And I think that explains why some countries are successful and some countries do well despite the fact that they have some kind of welfare state properly organized. So I wonder what the two discussants, so nobody on the podium so far talked about this. It was always evaded. I want to know your opinion on this. I mean, why is there such a robust, positive relationship between the openness of an economy and the welfare state?
I asked you about the welfare state, and you also implicitly, but
I haven't seen those figures, but it sounds very plausible to me. Then it's a question, what is cause and effect? And I would argue that the open economies are normally, over time, the richer economies. If I look at the development of the welfare state in my own country, or public sector, general terms, it was a question of when we could afford it. When we were poor, we couldn't afford it. When we became richer, we could afford more. And the more we expand the economy and are successful, the more we can also expand the provision of different public services. Some of them are good. I mean, we need police, we need defense, we have a pension system, we need a health system, which I think we have organized. By the way, that's interesting with the US. I had recently looked at it the other day. The US system of health costs twice as much as ours, as a proportion of GDP, twice as much. And on virtually every indicator, it delivers worse results. That doesn't say that we don't do stupid things in Sweden. We do stupid things in Sweden, in our public sector as well. But I would say, on the cause and effect thing, I would say is when we become richer through openness, that we can afford the public goods. If we are poor, we can't afford them. Then, hopefully, we devise them in such a way that they further the further development of society and takes care of the different things that we talked about.
But it's not only a question of being able to afford it, but also a question of political decision. And
Yep.
there you might not be. You might
Look,
not agree with this data.
No, I think what he said, you have more open economy, you have more growth, you end up with surplus value that the government can confiscate and redistribute as it wishes. However, the question, and therefore that's why the two look like they're tracking with each other. I think the more interesting question is economic growth in the size of the welfare state. Because you can look like, oh, we can afford this now, but can you continue to afford it? And if you look at the pensions, the government-run pensions, the defined benefit pensions that have been committed to in Europe and in the United States, the state level, national level, they can't possibly continue without eating up the entire economy. So how does it track with growth? And I would argue that you're better off going for growth and less welfare state, and certainly more individual control. I don't know how much this is done in Europe, but the United States almost all new pension systems are defined contribution, 401k, IRA, and so on, where people put their own money in and their employer puts some in, but then that's their money. They don't end up like Chicago in 25 years going, oops, we forgot to steal the money to give to you, so you're screwed. And it's your money, you invest it, you control it, and when you walk away from that job, you take that money with you.
Over there, and the next one over there.
So thank you very much.
No?
So thank you. Just maybe picking up on Professor Fair's point a little bit. I agree with Prime Minister Bildt that the world has really gotten a lot much better than the past generations, and we probably don't give that enough estimation. And also Katja's point that there's sort of a red herring, this whole globalization thing. But I mean, there's no denying the point. There's been a massive increase in inequality, and I'm just sort of wondering whether we could get away from this sort of income tax, you know, how it's measured and where it's taxed, et cetera, and really focus on wealth. Because if you look at it, the companies that actually make the most amount of money, or actually the most valuable companies in the world, companies like Amazon, don't even make money. And the people I know that are very wealthy, they're pretty good at not paying taxes. And if you just have a very small 1% of the population, which has more wealth than 90%, then why isn't it politically feasible maybe to look at an inheritance tax and sort of taxing wealth at the end of the game as opposed to taxing income just each year along the way? So I'm just interested in what you think on that. Also like to hear your view on how you think the U.S. tax reform is going to come out, just from your point of view.
Sure. I'll give it to you quickly. The House has passed its bill through the committee. It will vote Thursday of this week, 3 days from now. And there are no amendments. It will pass. Okay. The Senate has done its outline. It will be written down in committee before Thanksgiving. You guys have Thanksgiving? Anyway, third Thursday in the month. And then in the last week of November, the Senate will vote on the Senate bill. So the House and the Senate bill will be done by the end of November. They'll pass. When you look at them now, they fit together like a glove. One goes to 20% today, one goes to 20% a year from now. They both they're exactly the same for the next 50 million years, okay? But there's a 1 year difference. I think even congressmen and senators can figure out how to bridge that gap. And there are a number of other things that really are quite easily put together. They're not on different planets. There are times when the House does one thing, the Senate does one thing, they end up on a third planet because they have nothing in common. These are going to be easy to do. It'll be law of the land before Christmas, and almost all of it will take effect January 1st, except for faster expensing. That'll take place the day the House bill was put in a month ago. So if you've made a decision, it won't punish you because we don't want you waiting to do investment. On taxing wealth, the United States, we have 50 states. 39 have abolished their death tax, almost all fairly recently. Sweden just got rid of their death tax. Norway got rid of theirs. It doesn't seem to be the direction people are going. And in the U.S., the thing that makes me happiest about how the U.S. is going is that for all this talk about inequality and so on, and most people don't have to pay the death tax because it only hits some people, that 70% of people poll say they don't want a death tax because they don't envy somebody else's success and they don't care if the guy down the street has another car. That's a very healthy society. That makes me very happy.
We have one question there, and I'm taking the other one just after it to gain some time. Yes, please.
Thank you. 2 questions. Mr. Norquist has been very outspoken, so will I try to be, on regulation. You said deregulation is really, really helpful.
Immigration?
Regulation.
Deregulation.
Regulation.
If you look at Germany and the aftermath of the crisis 2007-2008, if Mr. Norquist would have a say, Stuttgart would look now more likely to Detroit than it does, because there would have been a massive layout in the automotive sector, people having to move somewhere else, and when the industry picked up again, there wouldn't have been the labor force qualified. The German solution to it was short-time labor, flexible markets, but keep the people who already had the knowledge within the system. How do you react to this? Question 2 to both of you. It's always about education. Can you see a world filled with robots and with people still living in valleys, be it in Wales or in Maine that just say, sorry, I don't have the brains for it. I can't really qualify for a digital age. What would you do with them? Would you still not support them in any sense? Would you just let them die, or would you still think there is enough labor working around for them to make a living?
Good.
Let me just
sorry.
take the other question as well. Here, please.
I am Swedish as well as Mr. Bildt. I have two questions. One of the reasons why we get this kind of, we can say, unconventional politics today with Trump and other so-called populists is that people feel powerless. And that is because they know they cannot really affect the politics by voting, because over the politics we have a great layer of bureaucracy, and big bureaucracy is integrated everywhere, and they do almost all what they want with our tax money. And so one of the roots of the problem is, to my opinion, I want to know from Mr. Norquist especially, is that because the big bureaucracy really set the rules, people feel powerless and then they vote for unconventional new parties. And the other thing is that if you have a lot of immigrants coming, like a shockwave, like happened in Sweden and in Germany, you have a lot of essential services from the state that do not deliver anymore. Hospitals, police, and so. And people feel that they are taxpayers, but they feel marginalized, and they feel that normal politics don't care about them because they think they are, especially on the conservative side, I think they get people more or less for free voting for them, like Angela Merkel. What shall we do to get people more involved?
Thank you. So we have 4 questions, 2 short answers, and then we're going to take another 2 questions over there. Structural changes, education, the help for those who don't match with digitalization, and the people feel powerless because of bureaucracy.
Yeah, on immigration, one of the things we used to do in the United States, and I think is a great idea, is people had sponsors. And they came over and the sponsor said, I'll make sure this guy doesn't go on the dole. Or you can come when there's a job. I mean, I'm not arguing for open borders. I'm arguing for a more open society and a more willingness to make it easier for people to come if there's a job or if somebody says, I will sponsor that person to come here, go to school, go to work, and so on. We used to do that in the country, and people would say, if things go wrong and he loses a job or what happens, I'll pay for his cost, not somebody else. I think that the lack of control is a big sense of it. I mean, when you hear people in Britain talk about the European Union, their question is, will our government, the guys in Britain, make stupid laws for us, or will all those people over in Brussels make stupid laws for us? We want local stupid laws. And there's this sense that they'll have more control over the bureaucrats locally than the other. In the States, a lot of people say, I'd rather have the state do things rather than the federal government. I don't think local is any improvement over national, but I do think that 50 states making 50 different decisions are likely, somebody's likely to get it closer to right, and the guy who's doing it very wrong, it'll be clear that Vermont's misbehaving. But if you impose one stupid idea from the national government, you never know what made it go wrong. You don't know that it was that law. It could be something else. So the sense of control, I think, bothers people, but I think competition, federalism, rather than states' rights. States don't have rights, people have rights. States have powers. As to bureaucracy, I mean, I would go through the list of in the United States, we have $2 trillion in costs of regulations, and the taxi regulations, which kept 1 million people who are now Uber drivers and Lyft drivers in the United States out of work and made it a crime for them to do what they're now doing to make money, that those regulations were destructive and a bad idea and not something we should have been paying millions and tens of millions of dollars to hire people to tell people you can't drive cars and get paid for it. Or when we deregulated trucking, because for about almost 70 years. We regulated who could drive trucks, when and where. We did the same thing with railroads, which we finally got rid of. We did the same thing with planes and with buses. And we said, you know what, this is all stupid, and we threw it out, and transportation costs dropped 20%. What was the government service those regulations were giving us? Transportation that cost 20% more than it needed to, kept minorities and young people out of jobs because they couldn't go through the bureaucracy and get a lawyer to get the right to drive a truck across town. So you start with the really stupid stuff, and then you can get into the question of the hard cases. What about this? Well, we have $2 trillion of problems. Let's get through the first trillion, and then we can debate this other stuff. But as to do we leave somebody behind, I would argue that we've been there before. 90% of Americans, and then 75% of Americans, and then 50% of Americans lived on the farm, and they did move off the farms. We didn't have a welfare system which said, stay on the farm, it's okay, we'll just feed you enough to keep you there. They said, I want a better job, nobody's paying me to do anything else, and they moved to other places and cities, and they got better jobs. Not a bunch of starving farmers wandering around, although we're down at 1% to 2% of the population farming, not 75, 80, 90%. We're doing the same thing in manufacturing, where we have fewer people working for manufacturing, but we're doing more manufacturing than ever before in terms of the value of what's been produced. So these changes happen.
A couple of questions, starting with the people in the valleys, wherever they could be. Do they have a future in the digital age, to phrase it in those particular terms? Yes, I do think they have. As a matter of fact, I think we are only in the beginning of the digital age. This is going to play out over a long period of time. But what I see happening is increasing possibilities for those. To take as one concrete example, outside of Stockholm, we've got the Stockholm Archipelago, where there's 20 or 50,000 islands, I don't know, but there's lots of them. And there were people living there in the past. They were fishermen or smugglers or whatever they did, but they were living there. Then they disappear to a large extent. Now they're coming back. Why? Because new communication technologies and digital services makes it possible for them to live there and at the same time be part of the economy. And the same would apply, I guess. And the digital technologies, I mean, we associate them with being a programmer and coding and whatever. I haven't a clue how you do that. But the modern digital technologies makes it easier for people who don't understand a thing. I don't understand how a telephone works even, by the way. I don't even think about it. But the digital technologies will have the same effects. I think it's going to be positive from that point of view as well. I'm a technological optimist. I agree with that. Bureaucracy. Yeah, too much bureaucracy, I'm against it. Haha, that being said. Too much regulation, I'm against it. But of course, some we need. We need courts, we need defense, we need a couple of regulators, we need financial supervision, we need X numbers of things, but not too much of them. And we've had essentially rather good experience in Sweden of deregulation. I mean, we were fairly early in deregulating telecoms and things like that, and we had a boost of our economy in those particular sectors. That doesn't mean that we should take away all of it, but I'm more in favor of lighter and integrated regulation, particularly in the European sphere. I think that's far better. Then people feel that they don't have power. True, to some extent, and I think some of that in some countries is associated with the migration crisis of 2015. But going back to the experience of my country, to some extent of Switzerland, the previous big migration crisis wave we had was the Balkan Wars. I was Prime Minister at the time. We took in a huge number of people. It was very difficult. We had an anti-immigration party entering in parliament. If I look at the track record now, I can see that that particular group, and we're talking now in the order of more than 100,000 people, the track record of those sort of 20, 25 years later is that they are doing, on the average, slightly better. I mean, some of them failed miserably. Some Swedes do as well. Some of them are in parliament, in government, and in business and whatever, but essentially they've been a benefit to our society. It was some difficult years. And I happened to look on the taxi on the way in on the Swiss national football team. And I was happy to note a couple of Swiss people there. But otherwise, the Balkans seems to be better represented than Switzerland. So they must have been doing something good for Switzerland as well.
Thank you very much. We have two very, very last questions coming in by Twitter with two very, very short answers because we're running out of time. Please.
So yeah, we have a few questions posted online, and we encourage you to
Choose the best one.
Okay, well then. Both of you argue that the globalization backlash really is a consequence of the financial crisis, which made people grumpy. Yet there will be another crisis someday. How do you think we can prevent that people turn against immigrants and free trade in the next recession?
Okay. And the other one?
So, but here it was partially answered already, so I think it's not worth answering it anymore.
Okay. So, how about the next crisis? How to prevent going deeper into populism and
Well,
nationalism?
in more general terms, I would say that we have entered into a more difficult, apart from, we are discussing primarily economic issues here, but if going to geopolitics and certain other factors, I think we have entered in a more difficult phase of global development. We need to look better at the resilience of our societies, of all of the different systems that we have, so that we will be better able to handle the shocks and the upheavals that are likely to be there in the outside world that will impact our societies. And that is very important that we are able to do that, we as politicians or whatever we are, because otherwise people will lose confidence in us. If people feel that we are no longer in control, the one way or other, then we are in difficulty. But if they feel that we have structures and awareness and intellectual preparedness to be able to handle things, then I think we would be able to handle it better.
How do we deal with financial crises? I think the same way we dealt with the devastating crisis in 1921, which you don't remember because the federal government didn't do anything, as opposed to the one that we tried to fix in 1929, and it lasted somewhere between 10 and 15 years. But you can also get Fannie and Freddie Mac, which helped Fannie, Freddie Mae, and Freddie Mac, which in the United States helped to create the last one we had, break them into little pieces, sell them off, get the government out of the financial issue, and then we have to decide whether we really want government-run currencies or something closer to Bitcoin. But a government-run currency that is stable and attached to something of value is better than one that the government just wakes up in the morning and decides how much the dollar's worth.
So, thank you very much. Oh, we don't know. No government, strong government, against globalization.
Not no government.
Small government, small,
but this
very small. Thank you very much,
Clever
Mr.
government.
Norquist. Thank you very much, Mr. Bildt, for this discussion.